Welcome to the Geisland Podcast. I'm Mitch Van Acker. Today I'm talking with Greg Lookerse. Greg is an interdisciplinary artist and educator whose work considers the nature of sacred objects. He's received a host of impressive awards and has recently released an epistolary novel called Notes from Underwater. Since first taking Greg's design class a few years ago, we've built up a great friendship through long conversations much like the one you're about to hear. We discussed George Saunders' recent book, A Swim in a Pond in the Rain, as a sort of baseline for our discussion, but we venture off into various topics including art, writing, Star Wars, propaganda, and more. Enjoy. I'm here with Greg Lookerse. So Greg, just to start things off, I know we had talked about a swim in a pond in the rain before, but before we get into it, if I could just have you kind of explain a little bit of your background and what you do and your approach to art and literature, if you could.
Yeah. So I'm an artist and designer, and I teach. I'm a professor here at Hope College. And part of my job in beyond just the actual job descriptions and things like that is to think about art and design. And as I find myself teaching them, I have to consider like what it is that I'm doing. Many people, no one wants to talk about what art is because it's such a messy question, and it is a term that has evolved significantly over time. And yet, if I'm going to do this thing, I feel like I need to at least have some idea about what I'm talking about. I at least have to think about it. Wendell Berry has a great essay that he calls The Responsibility of the Poet, and in that he talks about this idea that it is necessary for him to at least consider what a poem is. And I think he does it in a nice, humble manner where it's like he's not saying that he has the absolute definition, but rather he has some insights into that. So I hope that I have gained some insights into art and design, and it's part of my desire is sort of publicly there's this conception, especially amongst contemporary art, that it is not for people, but it's for these people who have elite knowledge and understanding of art history and you can't appreciate it unless you bend the knee and read the wall text and, watch some sort of strange film. And I think that that's wrong. And so I'm intrigued by a Swim in a Pond in the Rain by George Saunders because I think he has, in my opinion, the most pertinent kind of explanations about the creative process that we see today that contemporary artists and writers and, artists in the broadest sphere are engaging in. And I think it's extremely helpful. Yeah.
Yeah, well, and the book is about fiction specifically, but I find, excuse me, I find even it has so many parallels to poetry, and obviously you're drawing the point that it has a lot of relevance to other forms of art,
Yeah.
And what's that crossover like for you?
Well, I think that, art historically, or not even art historically, but historically, there have been all kinds of definitions of art, and this is why you get different kinds of movements, So one of the ones that's most evident and easy to point out, and it's one that tons of people still hold today, is this idea of art, true art, is the most skillful manifestation of a human acting in that art. And so you'll have sayings like, the way in which Kobe was shooting basketballs, it's like art. Or you'll have books like The Art of Motorcycle Maintenance. And that is a completely legitimate definition of art, of basically the highest performer in any human endeavor. That is the peak of that art. And so in that sense, it's like art would be any realm of human activity that can be perfected with skill. And, that's a functional definition. I find it troubling because what that means is, motorcycle maintenance, great. Basketball, great. Painting, awesome. Murder is also a realm of human endeavor that can be improved by skill. And so if you use that definition of art, then you would look at things like the terrors of the 20th century, of all the genocides, and you would say those are artists performing at their highest level in acts of atrocities and genocide. And you have to assent that that is a proper usage of that term, because your definition is what I just stated. And I don't find that very tenable. And also, if everything is an art and you're just looking for the peak performer in it, okay, like you have a contest and you do the Olympics every 4 years and all the different things, and then you give the medal to the person who wins. That's not that interesting to me. Also I think most people, as soon as they start realizing that, they can think, it's not that interesting to find the best murderer or the best, abuser or anything like that. Like that isn't that compelling. Whereas we can experience things that almost universally every single human being on this planet would be like, I don't know what art is, but I know that that's something of it. A little bit of that famous definition of pornography of I can't define it, but I know it when I see it. A lot of people have that experience of art. And so you see this weird experience manifesting itself, and it affects thousands, millions, billions of people. And I think if you have a broader definition, you can start to see that there's tons of connection, whether it be a poem that affects you, as Saunders is talking about, a story, a piece of music. And so what I think Saunders is getting at is this idea of art in the broadest sense does not matter about medium, it matters about meaning and impact on humans. And so I have a conception of art, or a definition of art, as the artificial application of meaning to material. And I mean material in the broadest sense. You have conceptual artists who are working with time, and they're trying to point at the idea that time is a thing, even though I can't point to time anywhere in this universe. And so they're using time as a medium or a material to become meaningful. And so it's this transcendent kind of embodiment. So, for example, you've got, we could use just like Star Wars is on the mind, if you don't mind if I use Star Wars.
Let's go there.
Yeah, you're not the most intense or deep work of art, but you have all kinds of meanings coming out in it. And case in point, if you just look back to the 1980s, when The Empire Strikes Back, Darth Vader, the Mandela effect, everyone says, Luke, I am your father. He actually says, I am your father.
Yeah.
But he says that, and audiences gasp. Why? Because it means something. Mm-hmm. It's this surprising thing of, here's this hero that we're enjoying, we're rooting for him. We understand, especially in your first watch of Empire Strikes Back, he's been dealing with this confusing, weird gremlin Yoda creature who doesn't say things straightforwardly, but is supposedly wise, and he feels he needs to go do what is right, which is save his friends. And he fails, and he's confronted by this evil, death-dealing figure of Darth Vader, and then Darth Vader reveals, I'm your father. And that is literally surprising, as in, for the audience members who were sitting there, spoiler alert, sorry, everyone who hasn't seen it, too late for that. It literally has an impact. People's heart rate changes, their physiology changes, their emotional whatever they're feeling at that moment changes, especially for the people who are paying attention to it. And that's one of the biggest things about folks who don't like Star Wars. It's generally because for some reason, it doesn't connect with them. And so they're not really paying attention. So when Darth Vader says that, it's relatively meaningless. Hence, it has no impact. And so things have meaning in all sorts of manners, and art is the manner in which we artificially imbue meaning. Because there's nothing meaningful about a weird man wearing a strange black costume, standing in a fake set, and just saying random lines.
Yeah.
But instead, we craft them, as all of the artists involved in that endeavor crafted it so that a particular set of things happened one after another with all sorts of supporting things, whether it be sound, lighting, costuming, the writing, all of that, so that this one moment could be experienced in its most meaningful manner. That's what artists do. We rearrange things so that when they are experienced, the meaning presents itself and confronts you. And, I can't think of an artist yet who has done that so perfectly that every single human being ever would give that artwork their attention. But there are some that have come close. I mean, weirdly enough, like millions upon millions of people a year go and look at the Mona Lisa. It's like that, for some reason, that painting. I mean, I have some ideas, but that would be a whole other conversation.
Maybe. Yeah.
But it gets people's attention compared to, you go to any coffee shop. Is anyone actually looking at any of those paintings? On some level, those paintings, whether it be on the artist or on the decorator, or, maybe there's just not the right light shining on it, but it's not getting as many people's attention. And so that's where the artist and the designer come into play. Designers thinking about, how do I get people's attention? How do I get them to pay attention? And the artist is trying to think, how do I make things meaningful? Mm-hmm. And frequently, the lack of success, and I'll say this even in my own part, the lack of my success is where those two things don't come together very well. I might be making something meaningful, but no one's paying attention. Or I make something that gets people to pay attention, but it's not very mm-hmm. meaningful. And so it's like, the great works of art, the things that survive thousands, if not tens of thousands of years, are the things that do both.
Yeah. Well, and one of the things that I like so much about this book is that it gives, we were talking about this earlier, but there's this, it almost seems naive to think that there is something that could be that you could objectively evaluate a story. Mm-hmm. It seems now that the in thing is the thing. Well, everything is subjective, and these meanings are basically, some people would even say it's a consequence of power dialectics. The Foucault people would say this, like coalescing upon a work of art, and you only feel that way because of the systems of power that have shaped it in a certain way, and the artist doesn't really even have much impact in general. And I think this is one, in a very humble way, and obviously this wasn't his intention, but he really showed how the construction of a story has something approaching a physiological and almost mathematical precision to where I do think that there is a kind of universal truth that can be gleaned in a properly organized story. Mm-hmm. It's subjective, of course, like you say. No artist has captured everybody's attention and has succeeded in that sense. But subjectiveness is limited, and I think that there are sort of objective, there's objective workings within any piece of art and how you arrange meaning in order for that to happen. Yeah. And I think that this is one of the best and simplest and straightforward ways in which not only making that case, but also showing people how to do it. This is the single best. I've read so many how to write story books whatever, and how to write a screenplay in so and so days or whatever, and all of them suck. All of them have no. There's actually one point in the book where he says, all of these books work for some people, but he uses the Buddhist metaphor of pointing at the moon. The pointing finger is not the moon; it's pointing at the moon. Yep. And I don't know. I think this one gets closer to pointing at the moon and telling you that it's pointing at the moon.
Right.
Well, so you can get, you can get into it
Yeah.
so much better. I mean,
Well, and I think at its core, to some degree, we'd call it like practical. Nowadays, we'd call them like writing hacks. The practical writing hacks that this book offers is, I think there's really only one, and that is the goal of the writer is to get the reader to read the next sentence. So every sentence has to be crafted in a manner that gets the reader to read the next sentence. And it's like, that's an impossible task. You know, you imagine for some reason someone is reading a book on an airplane, and suddenly there is a, catastrophic failure and an engine blows up. They're going to put that book down, I'm guessing.
yeah, I would think.
So it's like, to require art to be perfect and for the storyteller to literally, I mean, that's like an interesting story in of itself. It's like the Monty Python sketch, the joke that's so funny it kills you.
Yeah.
It's like, could you actually write a book that's so engrossing that even in a plane crash, the people would still have to read it? It's like, it would be terrible. It's just like the myth of Narcissus staring into his own reflection. Maybe that's what it is. But so in that sense, it's like that alone. And so then what he does in this book is he looks at, I think it's seven different short stories, or is it 6? 7. I've got it right in front of me. Probably.
I think 7 actually.
Fact check us here. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Yes. And he goes through, and he doesn't really tell you what it is that it does. In some of them, he looks at like the symbolic echoes of like, look at how it starts. I'm thinking of The Singers in particular, where he's talking about, look at how it begins and what happens throughout the story. He's not giving you some sort of formula. He's saying, look, all of these authors got us to read the next sentences.
By doing this.
Right.
Yeah.
How did they do that? And the thing is they did it differently. Every single one of them. And that's actually one of the beauties of what it means to be human and be creative, is that as long as you understand that you're still talking to humans and still presenting artwork to humans, there's some degree of a boundary there, I don't know what it's like to not be a human. But if you try to make artwork for, say, an AI, I don't even know if an AI can interpret artwork. Can an AI understand things to be transcendently meaningful? I don't know.
Yeah.
So it's like I can't even tell you how to go about doing that. But you can say, we know things are meaningful when people pay attention to them.
Yeah.
So if you and you think about this with like children all the time, like as children are learning to tell stories, or as they're learning, when your first drawing finally actually gets someone's attention, when someone actually, it's not just your mom pinning it up, but instead someone at a school teacher points it out. It's like you're suddenly realizing there's something here.
Yeah.
I did something that I was just normally do, and suddenly a bunch of people are paying attention to it. And maybe some people recoil from that because it makes them uncomfortable. Other people celebrate that and think like, this is exciting. I think that's all the performers and comedians are the kinds of people who they feed off of that, of, oh my God, I got people to finally pay attention. How did I do that? And then they're practicing it over and over and over, trying to hone it down in order to gain people's attention. And that's where it's like subjectivity to some degree, but it's within limits, because as the makers of the recent Batgirl film that they've spent $100 million on, and it's performing so badly that they've canceled it. Clearly, you can't.
I didn't even hear about it.
Yeah, this literally happened this week,
wow.
And it's like, clearly you can't make people pay attention to just anything.
Yeah.
It has to be something that people will pay attention to. It's not even want to pay attention to. That's where the subjectivity came in and it failed, is they think that people will only pay attention to the things they want to pay attention to. It's like this is where my design background, all of that like French Foucault, Derrida theory in grad school, it doesn't hit the mark. Otherwise, marketers would be using that. Yeah. And instead, what do you have? You have sex sells, you have danger and excitement sells, you have violence and gun sell, because those are the things we need to pay attention to, right? Like You need to know if you're in danger, basically at all times.
Yeah.
You need your base desires to be fulfilled in some manner, basically at all times. It's like this is how it works, because that's how humans work. And so to deny all of that objectivity, it's just, it's ineffective. That's,
Well, and it's interesting to, like, because I always notice that, especially the continental philosophers, with some important exceptions, kind of get freaked out by art. Like, I think Kant was very freaked out by it. Like, he tried to explain it and such, because it has this, like, especially the philosophers that had a very high view of their mind as the transcendent, rational, big spark. And that's all there is. And it's kind of in this vacuum, sealed off from the rest of your body. But then they're confronted with a piece of art, and you get this bizarre experience where an arrangement of things is sort of moving you beyond your will. And there's a lot of philosophers that I think got freaked out about that, and it was interesting.
Well, and Kant's interesting too. I mean, so he writes, what is art? And, to grossly simplify it, it comes down to these high ideals of the thing that physiologically freezes you, but enables your mind to continue contemplating things that are beyond your human experience. And so that frequently is considered some degree of a definition of the word sublime. And so it's like standing on the edge of the Grand Canyon. I've done it. It's terrifying. Your body literally recoils from it, especially when you've had height-related traumas like me. It's even more so terrifying. And I can't make myself, with my brain, walk towards that edge. I have to back away from it, and because it's real danger. So what Kant is saying, we can artificially create experiences of danger where we feel all of the physiological effects, but our brain knows we're safe. And so at the end of the day, if I'm looking at an amazing painting of the Grand Canyon, I can get the physiological feeling of standing on the edge of the Grand Canyon while remaining safe. And so it's like, it's all of this, like, got to keep that head safe. That head is safe. And so therefore, in the actual experience of the Grand Canyon, I can't even think because I'm so distracted by the danger. But in the art, I'm able to have the experience that lets me contemplate that thing. And so you can see some interesting experiences there, but you can see also a complete degradation of all sorts of forms of artwork. If it isn't putting you in some sort of crazy, out of the ordinary experience, then it's not very valuable. And so, this is happening in the 1800s, and the modernists come in and in lots of ways, like, most people are familiar with some of the paintings of Van Gogh. And it's like, Van Gogh is saying basically a complete counter argument to that of, no, you don't have to be in some extreme place to experience something transformative that you can actually contemplate. You can look at a field of wheat. You can look at someone sowing seeds, or other folks like Monet. You can look at a haystack, the same haystacks, over and over, and see the infinite differences and the infinite amount of color variations in that, and that's enough. And so it's like, even with someone like Kant, like, it's like they can't. I think that there's a response to something like the mundane arts, so to speak, where they want to try to deny that they have an impact, but they can't, because they do have an impact. Like, I like to go to museums without any research. I like to be completely surprised, completely caught off guard. And a little bit of that is this notion of, I want to make sure that my biases are not guiding my experience of the art. And so I'm trying to enable myself to see the things that I wouldn't normally pay attention to. So, like, I'm not a huge Monet fan, and I went to the MoMA, and I didn't research the fact that the water lilies are there, and a lot of them are there. And so I walked into this room. If I had researched beforehand, I would have looked at the brochure, I would have seen where things are, and I would have been like, water lilies, skip that, I don't care. Instead, I walked into that room and was immediately affected by the most beautiful paintings I've ever seen. And I immediately knew what they were. Like, I've seen pictures of them, but I had never experienced them before. And it's like if I had built up those biases, if I had allowed myself to get all of that information, I probably would have skipped it. And I would have missed one of the most transformational experiences I've ever had. And that's just like,
Yeah. I had a similar experience in the Prado. I was on a school trip there. So, and I mean, I was kind of just meandering by myself and didn't have anything. And I walked rather off guard into the room that they had Goya's black paintings.
yeah,
And it's all dark, very dim, like, and like this very subtle, precise light on all of them. It like covered like the whole room. And I walked in there and just immediately, and I really didn't know. I mean, I had seen Jupiter devouring his sun in pictures and stuff. Mm-hmm. But when I walked in there, it was like all the oxygen just got sucked out of the room. Like it was like a roundhouse kick to the face. I mean,
Yeah.
it was, and it was one of the most startling and horrifying. I mean, and there's another example where I guess it's extreme, but it's an extreme. All of those are extreme depictions, but they're ugly, and like really, really deeply ugly. And yet you have this response to them that is something beyond just pretty and beautiful, but it's beautiful in a very terrifying way, which is also a different complication in that.
This is one of the things that especially coming from a historic tradition in the Christian faith and seeing, Christians more than, especially evangelical Christians, more than most people are so afraid of art. They know there's some sort of power there. I mean, legitimately, I think some of them acknowledge this kind of power of art to seduce you.
Yeah.
And that makes them fearful. They don't. There's a degree of discipline within the Christian faith, of some sort of. It's kind of like the commands to not get drunk. It's a little bit like there's a fear that you can lose control of yourself, and this is like traditionally very accurate. There's certain orchestral pieces that have occurred that have caused riots and things like that, and so there was this like strange fear. I don't know. It'd be interesting to see if people actually still hold that strong of an opinion of the arts, but I think realistically, a lot of folks right now are talking about the fact that there's a lack of beauty in our popular culture. And it's difficult to parse exactly what they mean by beauty, but really I think what they're saying is attractive aesthetics that are harmonious, something along those lines. And many of the Christian faith seem to have this idea that art should do that art should reassure you, it should comfort you. And, some art can do that. But if you have that as a limit, like, first of all, you're asking artists to make artwork you don't really need to look at. You don't have to discover something new in something comforting. It's the same of like, why do we even call some foods our comfort foods? It's because we know what to expect. And so when you need that thing that isn't going to challenge your appetite, that isn't going to challenge your taste, but instead is going to literally be exactly what you expect it to be, great. We want some comfort food. But if all you eat is comfort food, it literally leads to sluggishness. Why can't I think of the name for gluttony? That's it.
Yeah.
Gluttony and laziness. It's like you need some food that challenges you. And that's where it's like, it's odd to me, this kind of call for only beautiful art. It's like, well, you can only talk about pretty things, and the world is filled with ugliness. And I think, like, I've recently reread Brothers Karamazov for the third time, and it is an incredibly beautiful book, but it's an incredibly ugly book as well. This one chapter in particular called Rebellion, Dostoevsky forces us to look at the thing that we would rather ignore, and that is mainly children suffering. And he does that for an incredibly good reason. I've just grabbed this book by Robert Adams called Art Can Help, which is the book that I named my YouTube channel after. And the first line of the introduction is, "It is the responsibility of artists to pay attention to the world, pleasant or otherwise, and to help us live respectfully in it." And that's one of those things of, if you deny a major portion of our experience, one, you're not prepared when it comes. It'll knock you off your feet. And so, two, you are not preparing, especially your children, so to speak, when it comes. If you tell your children that everything is wonderful, the world's a beautiful place, and there is no pain and suffering, and that they are the most unique snowflake, that they will always be wonderful no matter what they do, that they can do no wrong, it's going to be hard for them when they interact with people who aren't their family, for whom they can do wrong. And to some degree, when we're asking our artists to just make comfortable, not incendiary artwork, we're asking them to do that, to actually treat us like children. We can't handle the truth, so please spoon feed me something that I will enjoy. Give me, it's like Mary Poppins, give me a spoonful of sugar, but not to help the medicine go down. Just give me a spoonful of sugar, please.
Yeah. Well, and I think there's an interesting metaphor to comfort food and sugar, especially because it's almost like, comfort food has a lot of monocultural elements to it, usually, potatoes, starches. Mm-hmm. And in a similar way, I think what makes a strong ecosystem and one that allows for a variety of beautiful plant life and animal life is one that has sort of authentic diversity, mm-hmm. To try to that makes it robust. Whereas if you have if you strip everything if you strip an environment of everything that you want, per se, it's a weaker environment. It gets overrun, it burns down, and there's on a physical level, if you don't allow and tolerate even say the destructive aspects of nature, even wildfires are important to the health mm-hmm. of forests. If you stopped all wildfires everywhere, the forests would be weaker,
right?
And so it's interesting that there's a kind of metaphorical, at least, parallel between all that.
Well, and that's in a symbolic level. There's this degree of, I love this quote that's over on my board. It's all good soil is made of dead things, and I think that's true of art as well. All good art is made of these dead things that are brought back to life. We are constantly renewing and restoring things of the past, and there's this constant balance of a cycle of life and death, so to speak. And so all religious systems have these ideas pretty much, and there's just these ideas of the necessary cycle of a thing's lifespan is that it will eventually fade, but it doesn't fade forever. It fades so that it might come back again. But if you stop all of that, if you create an artificial stop where there's no death, so to speak, there's no acknowledgement of evil, then everything will die at once. Yeah. Because there will be no growth. But I think this gets to, so on page 60 of Saunders' book, he talks about what is happening when you're interacting with a story. And he says, a story is a series of incremental pulses, each of which does something to us. Each puts us in a new place relative to where we just were. Criticism is not some inscrutable, mysterious process. It's just a matter of, 1, noticing ourselves responding to a work of art moment by moment, and 2, getting better at articulating that response. That's the kind of I love his frankness. Uh-huh. And that's where that kind of if you take both of those ideas seriously, the one I just said from Robert Adams of artists are trying to notice the experiences of meaning through all life's activities, whether that be about death, suffering, love, joy, all of the things. Then they're crafting, because it's not just true of stories, but because even though there's, the whole Gestalt kind of psychology and the Gestalt manner in which a visual work of art impacts us, we still then have to look at the separate parts of especially large work, although some very simple work doesn't have that, but very large work, and you're reading it, so to speak, over time. You're looking at the left side of the painting, and then you're moving across to the right. So it's moving you in experience. And if you have the eyes to see it, so to speak, it might start to reveal things that at least weren't in your presence of mind at that moment. And so this, I think, is true. Like for me, I've done a lot of art historical research, looked at a lot of paintings, probably in the hundreds of thousands of images. And so frequently when I look at something, it is a direct reminder of things I've seen. Possibly even I've seen that painting before, even if it wasn't in person. And so there's this sense where you're building up a tolerance, so to speak. And so those who have a larger art historical bank of experience to draw upon are going to be able to experience more. Often this is where the arts in the 20th century and now into the 21st century lost the audience, the visual arts in particular, lost their audience because they jumped so far beyond the spoonful of sugar that helps the medicine go down. They only were giving medicine. And eventually people were like, no, I need some sugar with this. And that's why there's so much call for beauty now. But that's also why you see like other fields, some of the more celebrated fields in the 20th century that were working, oddly enough, I don't know exactly, I have some theories why, but music, like whether it be jazz or Bob Dylan, you had an explosion of amazing music that was doing what Mary Poppins says. They were putting medicine with sugar. Whereas the visual arts got rid of the sugar and went real abstract, real bizarre, and totally lost their audience. They maintained a very small sliver of an audience. That's not going well for us right now. There's all kinds of issues with the fact that it's a small audience. But they did maintain some, but they lost so many. And that's where I think my job is a little bit of both, of like helping folks who are illiterate in the realm of contemporary art understand how, some of these things I know in life are still there. They're just far more obscured, far more veiled. And then it's helping artists understand that like you can make really esoteric artwork, go for it, but realize how limited your audience is going to be. And that's where I like to teach art and design, because design is about connecting with your audience. All of the best designers know their audiences, they do research on the audience, and then they're able to understand the abilities of their audience to comprehend visual phenomena, so to speak. And so they're able to think, well, this is how I need to package this in order for it to sell. It's like artists need both. If more artists were better designers, more artists would be successful. And if more designers were better at thinking about meaning, there would be more interesting artists. And so it's like you need those two hands. You need
both.
Yeah.
Well, and back to the Saunders again, one of the, I think, indispensable things that I got from this book, and that I think a lot of young writers will get from this book, is the idea of, although I don't think he explicitly he somewhat explicitly mentions this, but the idea that you're anticipating what the audience is thinking, which it seems so obvious and seems like that's such an elementary aspect to writing. But so many young creative writers come from like the James Joyce and, this very romantic idea where it's their sort of solitary intelligence working on the masterpiece in the loft upstairs. And it becomes a sort of solipsistic type of thing where one of the most, it's so funny, but I think that even I neglected that tremendously. And just that simple, I just needed that simple truth to be told to me. And then I was like, oh, duh. I mean, a story is a method, a tool for communication. Yep. And that tool, it could be designed to communicate to a smaller audience, like the esoteric artist, or designed to reach a larger one. But the fact of the matter is you're still trying to communicate, right, to people, or you should. It's another question entirely if you even need to, but it certainly would be lonely.
Well, and that's the thing is like, sure, write the most esoteric poem, scream it to the stars, job done. You know, why are so, this is where you know that ideology starts to break down, because all of the people who do that are mad they don't have a larger audience. Why are you mad you don't have a larger audience? If it doesn't matter, and if there is no meaning, and if all of it's subjectivity, who cares? Like, first of all, there's billions and trillions of God knows how many stars. That's a much bigger audience than human beings. Why not just preach it to the stars then? It's like, we know that that's not satisfying. Whether it's true or not, that's not satisfying to us as humans.
Yeah.
And so we want audiences to pay attention. We want people to give us a feedback, to understand that what we're doing is meaningful. Because I'll read this other section about where Saunders is talking about what really is art, and it's kind of couched in this a couple different things where he talks about how you can't control the kind of artist you're going to be, which is really I'm sure we'll get to that. But then he talks about, let me just turn to it rather than trying to do two things at once. He's talking about this whole question. This is kind of this is like 3 paragraphs, but they're not long paragraphs. But he says, we often discuss art this way. The artist had something he wanted to express, then he just, expressed it. That is, we buy into some version of the intentional fallacy, the notion that art is about having a clear-cut intention and then confidently executing the same intention. The actual process, in my experience, is much more mysterious and beautiful and more of a pain in the ass to discuss truthfully. So he gives us so that's like what you're getting at, is there's some degree of, most people, I mean, I hear this all the time. I think it is manifested in the statement that students always bring forward, which is, well, my artwork is an expression of myself. And I'm like, first of all, okay, tell me about yourself then. And they can't tell me much. And then on top of that, it's like, what part of you is being expressed in this collage of black and white squares on this little piece of paper where I tried to tell you to, make it balanced? And then on top of that, it's like, how much time did you put into this? Like, 60 minutes. So you are so simple of a thing that you can express yourself in 60 minutes perfectly, enough that I can't criticize it? It's like, no, that's not what happened. You didn't express yourself. You probably barely even tried. And maybe actually because you didn't try, there might be something good there that we can find. But so then he goes and talks about the actual process of creating art. A guy, Stan, constructs a model railroad town in his basement. Stan acquires a small hobo, places him under a plastic railroad bridge near the fake campfire. Then notices that he's arranged his hobo into a certain posture. The hobo seems to be gazing back at the town. Why is he looking over there? At the little blue Victorian house. Stan notices a plastic woman in the window, then turns her a little, so she's gazing out. Over at the railroad bridge, actually. Suddenly, Stan has made a love story. Oh, why can't they be together? If only little Jack would just go home, to his wife, to Linda. What did Stan, the artist, just do? Well, first, surveying his little domain, he noticed which way his hobo was looking. Then he chose to change the little universe by turning the plastic woman. Now, Stan didn't exactly decide to turn her. It might be more accurate to say that it occurred to him to do so, in a split second, with no accompanying language, except maybe a very quiet internal yes. He just liked it better that way, for reasons he could not articulate, and before he had the time or inclination to articulate them. In my view, all art begins in that instance of intuitive preference. That's that. I think that is one of the most beautiful descriptions of the creative practice that I have ever encountered. I used to have a quote in my studio at all times, and I've memorized it, so I don't need it. But it's something might happen in your studio today. Make sure you're there to see it. And it's like that kind of what I'm doing in here is I'm taking materials and I'm rearranging them all the time. And sometimes it's actually why like our house is relatively organized and my studio is chaos, because I want to come in here, and in those moments, it almost always happens in the most distracted moments. I'm looking for my hammer. I can't find my hammer. I'm digging through things, throwing things around because I'm angry. And suddenly a paper lands on top of another one in a certain arrangement that I didn't notice before. And suddenly it's like, oh, there's something there. I never know what it is, but then it gets pinned up on the wall in that arrangement. And that's almost where so many of the things come from. Either that or my dreams. But so it's like these subconscious kinds of routines where what I'm really doing is not making very many choices of change, but usually it's telling myself when to stop changing something, because I'm noticing, okay, now there's something here. This is starting to have meaning for me, and if I can freeze that meaning and then present it, frame it in a manner maybe other people will see the same thing. And so the creative practice is not a process of asserting my will onto something. That's the design process. The design process says, I have a job I need completed. I need to make a chair for you to sit in. And then they take wood and they take all these materials and they bend them to their will. The creative process is, I'm going to start rearranging these things with no idea what's going to happen, hoping that faithfully something might occur, and there might be something there that I discover new and fresh. And that's what the creative practice is you are looking constantly, trying to assess, is this interesting?
Yeah, well, going back to writing specifically, it's the same thing. And I think that's another common misconception that this book sort of tears down, is that the story is already, intact, and you're just sort of executing a story that you've already constructed. And I think that this is actually what writer's block actually is.
Yeah.
It's an intolerance of ambiguity, and it's an intolerance to allow the work itself to speak in a sense, and not your own will. I mean, when you don't know what to do in a story and you have that experience of writer's block, it's basically you're at a point where you're on the vanguard of what you already know, and you have to go beyond it in order to finish a story. And that's how I think a lot of stories end up not getting finished, is because there's an intolerance on where and how to take it, and let it take itself in its own direction. I think that's what that is.
Yeah. Well, I mean, there's so many ways. I'll take it back to Star Wars because I'm making a video on Star Wars right now.
Okay.
That's on the
Yeah.
mind. But you think about that last movie, which I don't think the Return of the Jedi. That's what I'm talking about. That's the last movie.
Okay.
No,
Yeah.
there's more of them, unfortunately. I think about the rebels, they all go down to this weird forest planet. They're trying to destroy this thing. They got to destroy the new Death Star, and that's how they're going to win. Luke goes with them, of course, because he's the hero. Then suddenly, almost, it happens off camera, but in the script, Luke decides that this fight down here on the forest planet is not his battle, and suddenly he turns himself in. And the next scene we see is him with Vader. He's turned over his lightsaber. They're having a conversation. He's flying up to see the Emperor. Who writes that? It's dumb. It's bad in the sense of a movie. This is the most momentous choice your hero is going to make, to abandon his friends and go confront the evil face to face. It doesn't make sense. And yet, so thousands of people love that movie, and we gloss over that stupid little detail because we understand it means something else. Luke is with his friends. They're fighting a battle, and he realizes this isn't my battle. And instead, actually, I am more needed somewhere else. And we don't need to see him do that. But he does that, and we know it on such a level that he goes and has his own little fight, the sort of meta fight. They're literally watching the other fight in the stars while looking down on the planet, and the Emperor has seen everything, and he says to Luke, your vision has failed you. And that is the thing. Why does Luke have to go into this meta battle? Because he's fighting death. That's why. And so he needs to get away from the people who are just in this small fight. He needs to go to the big, great fight. And it just happens. And it's like, how did the writer even invent that? I can't conceive of it. At some point, someone just realized we have to get Luke up to fight Vader. This is the last movie. He's got to have a big standoff. How do we do it? And it's like, well, he abandons his friend. Well, how do we write that scene? I don't know. Like, this is where it's like, it's not a perfect story at all. Like, a great story, if Dostoevsky was writing Star Wars, it would be like way longer. God. But he would have this, this interesting conversation where Luke would have to convince his friends, and he'd have to explain what's going on, and he'd have to go into the psychology, and he would be torn, and the whole time he'd be wondering if he did what was right. And instead we get kind of this glossed over narrative, but it's this weird little thing that it's like, why did audiences around the world celebrate this strange story when it's so obviously flawed? Because it was leaning into something that made sense, that was meaningful, even though it didn't do it perfectly. And that's where Saunders even acknowledges this in this book, where it's like a lot of these stories aren't the best stories, but instead they have this thing that generates conversation and discussion and contemplation around a variety of ideas. They're like, it's like he chose the stories that have the most potential for you to discover something new, rather than the most well-crafted stories. And that's where this again is another sort of indictment of that idea that the best art is always the best achievement in that field is not at all. Like, we constantly celebrate. I mean, why is it that, like, especially here in America, why is it that we love the underdog? It's like, that's a better story. It's better for the one that didn't have a chance to win whatever than the one who you knew all along was the best winning and stomping the little guy. It's like, because that's not as meaningful. Very few of us are going to be at the top of any skill pyramid. Yeah. Almost all of us are going to be at the bottom. And so the stories that resonate are going to be the stories that say, those people at the bottom, you have a chance. And that's like, I mean, that's what America has literally founded itself on. And if you don't have stories telling us that, you're not going to continue that idea.
Mm-hmm. Well, and going back to the idea of flaws, I'm just curious to get your ideas on this, but there are certainly flaws that audiences don't tolerate. Mm-hmm. So we completely ignore that flaw. Mm-hmm. And even some of the prequel fans ignore a whole mess of flaws.
Oh, yeah.
Including myself. There's no one of the greatest emotional payoffs is the fight at the end of Revenge of the Sith. It's just this it's so gorgeously conceived and mind-blowing. But you had to slew through a lot of bad writing to get there.
Yeah.
So I don't know, maybe depending on the piece, there's a bit more tolerance. But I think it's interesting that there's certain flaws that an audience simply won't tolerate.
Yeah, I agree. I think that so we're just gonna. This is actually going to be about Star Wars.
Yeah,
Saunders.
Yeah. Well, we're allowing allowing it to go wherever it's wanted.
Right. So if you think about the prequels in particular, I can encapsulate why the prequels stand up, even though they're terrible. And that's simple. It's telling the story of Darth Vader. And so, one, it has an actual relatively good story that it's leaning on, right? The original Star Wars films, they did a bunch of things right. And a lot of that is because Lucas wasn't in control of them. He needed help. And he accepted that help. In the prequels, what you get is an interesting story. We're learning, how does Darth Vader end up, like, because the height of Darth Vader's story is a scene where he throws the Emperor off and then later asked to see finally with his own eyes. This is why my video is about how Star Wars is about vision. And so what you see in the prequels is the story of a young boy who's told he's the chosen one, and he has to bear this weight, but there's no one there to help him. He has no father, like literally, he's an immaculate conception. He is saved by these Jedis, but the one who really believes in him dies immediately. And then he's raised by these other Jedis, but they're all distracted. They're absent fathers. And instead, he's raised by his brother. And so Obi-Wan Kenobi, literally in that scene you're talking about, says, "You were a brother to me," to Anakin. And so what we see is the story of a fatherless child. It's the same story that plays out with Alcibiades in Greece, ancient Greece. You have an incredibly exceptional student, no disciplining father to help direct and control that. And instead what we end up with is the absolute monster. And then, so that's interesting. You literally don't watch the films now. That's all you got to know about it. Because it's still attached to something true and interesting and hopeful that the biggest monster can still be redeemed at some point in time. And it does that in a childish, poor manner. And so those movies are able to be, I think, tolerated because they're towards something that is along the lines of what you said earlier of objective truth. But it does so poorly.
Yeah.
And I think, so we can tolerate, I mean, that's why, like, parents can tolerate seeing their children in terrible plays, terribly rendered plays, as long as it's a good play. But if you have the children doing something like, whatever, hailing Hitler, no parent is going to stand by and let their child do that because that isn't true objectively. That is a falsehood. If we have some sort of bit of that happening, it needs to be very, very obvious that it's a joke and that it's being undermined by the rest of the story. And that's what it's like. So, and you see this across the board with any, what I would call propagandists, which are propagandists are designers to some extent. They need to tell a specific story, but they don't have the skills of an artist and they definitely don't have the creative practice. You see this like most obviously in like Christian films.
Yeah.
Christian films, they have this goal, right? We have to celebrate Jesus as king or whatever it is. I don't know. Like we have to make sure that everyone says the sinner's prayer after watching this movie. And that's what everything is driving towards that. And so they're cutting off. They might have some really interesting elements coming in that are surprising and nuanced and beautiful. But if they don't directly support that goal, it's cut off. And so what you get is an anemic story. You get a story that's it's not going to be deep. It's not going to have characters that are people. It's going to have everyone is going to be preaching all the time. And so most likely what you'll see in a Christian film is a caricature of an evil person, right? Like here's the atheist and their terrible preaching. And then you're going to have the caricature of the righteous person. Here's the holy guy that he's doing everything right and he's got the wonderful family. And yet the evil guy subverts him. And how does he overcome him? Not by, there's never any like he picks up a gun and, has to become an infiltrator. It's always, he just keeps being holy. And finally, his holiness breaks down the other guy. Yeah. And it's like,
which is not true. And it's
right.
And it's like, again, it's interesting that there's this, as Saunders mentions, Hemingway once said that everybody has a built-in shit detector.
Yeah.
And I mean, it's interesting to like two aspects of that is interesting to me. One, I just want to get your thoughts on the quote by Orwell that all art is propaganda. So you can go to that. But also to the point of propaganda, I'm fascinated by places or circumstances when propaganda is loved. And I think almost in a sincere way. I'm thinking particularly, socialist realism, basically the propaganda art pieces of the Soviet Union that are just very romantic. I mean, very corny. I mean, they're very, very corny. But people in the Soviet Union, because of their circumstances, absolutely adored it. So, like, is it possible to delude that built-in shit detector, and how does that happen?
Most certainly. I think so. Let's start with the Orwell thing. And like, I want to say, propaganda is an interesting term because I take it to mean something that propagates an idea. And so the term propaganda came into usage around, I believe it was World War I, when there was all of these visual things that were coming out that were only serving the propagation of the ideas of the party in control, or the enemy. And so they turned that term propaganda to mean that political thing. I use it far less like just in that political thing. So I use it as a term to say anything that's sole goal is to propagate an idea, or anything that really does propagate an idea. And so in that sense, it's like all art functions as propagation of ideas. Absolutely. And so I think propaganda is a neutral term. It's not good or bad. And what each individual has to decide is the propaganda that's bad will be the one that's lying to you, and the propaganda that's good is telling you the truth. So that's a little bit different than how it's been historically used. So I don't know exactly. I mean, Orwell probably was just so disturbed by the means that artists had at that time. We're talking artists are able to reach audiences in almost to the same degree as governments. The king was the only one who could get a message to all corners of the kingdom. And Orwell is coming to a time when everyone can do that. And now, way more so.
Yeah.
And so now, can you really say that everyone is that anyone can even act in a manner that is not considering that message to everyone else? And I'd say he's pretty accurate. I mean, look at us right here.
Yeah, exactly. Well, I mean, I'm thinking especially of his, I think, rather brilliant essay on Salvador Dali and how just really gross and, I mean, you can disagree. I mean, I disagree with certain parts of it, but he sort of, the whole thrust of that one, I don't know if you've read it. He basically says that it's a decadent and sensationalist kind of thing, and it could only, being the socialist that Orwell was, it could only find an audience among a degraded capitalist system, and and he draws on a lot of interesting parallels. He says that I think quite rightly identified a lot of Dali's penchant for old 18th century sort of Rococo draft artwork. And he basically said, here's this very extremely, utterly talented person. He also drives home the point that we should be able to talk about art that's despicable but still objectively good. So he hammers that home as well. But he said that he used this incredible skill and then just made a very degrading and sick form of art. So it's interesting that, yeah, Dali especially had immense influence and wealth in his time.
Yeah.
So
that's interesting. I'd have to read that to talk more about it.
Yeah.
But I think that it reminds me a bit of Michael Knowles, a conservative commentator, recently tweeted 2 images of Picasso's. One is one of Picasso's very early works where he displays his skill at rendering realistic or true to observation depictions of a family. And then one of his most hideous paintings, which is of this weeping woman. And he says something like, why would the person who can paint the image on the left, the really true to life image, choose to paint the painting on the right? And the thing that's interesting about him saying that is that he's implying that there's no good reason.
Well, so I should just clarify this. He said that you had this talented person, but because of the, again, decadent capitalist system that he was critiquing, because of that, you had this extreme talent that adapted his extreme talent to sort of accommodate the sickness of the culture, as he was saying it.
Right. See, I want to say, I think the two are saying something similar, and it's so one of the things, if you think about artwork, is it's about trying to get people's attention in order to communicate something, right? So that is propagating an idea. But you got to think about that in the sense of what gets people's attention. We have our eyes, obviously. We have so much of our brain dedicated to visual processing, and we have very, very good eyes for mammals in particular. And so we're talking about visual things, and then just think about the things you notice in the day, or when you're scrolling Instagram, what gets you to stop? And it's like, we can understand some of those things. And so to a large degree, there are these, attractive bodies, jarring noises, all of these things are literally like your physiology is geared towards that. But the other thing is well, what happens when you're in a sea of things? If you're on the subway, listening through crappy headphones as you're scrolling Instagram, is the same jarring noise going to get your attention when it has that competition going on? And probably not. If there's someone just yelling, at a medium volume in your ears, but there's literally a person yelling on the subway, you're going to pay attention to that person yelling on the subway, not the Instagram video. And so what artists are frequently doing is they're trying to figure out the milieu of the noise that we have, and then they have to set themselves up in contrast to that to be noticed. Now, most of them aren't doing this logically. And so I'd say Orwell is right insofar as when you're surrounded by like what the 20th century brought, which is massive amounts of beauty on all kinds of levels, whether that be massive amounts of pre-made furniture that's pretty cheap, same with housing. You think about the classic cookie cutter home, it's like that is so much more beautiful than the handmade frontier houses that they had in the 1800s. And so you have this whole milieu of extreme beauty, even though we look back on the 80s and whatnot and the 60s and 70s as well, that's so gauche or whatever, but at the time it's like we brought the opulence of regents and nobles and kings
and
to modern times. And so the fact that so many artists have to turn to dissonance and ugliness to get noticed, it's literally a product of the times. Now, is that a product of, let's say Orwell's right, is that a good sacrifice? The fact that the rest of society is doing so well that the artists have to be the degraded one? Or would you rather have a society where everyone is so degraded that in order for an artist to stand out, they have to write Les Mis?
Sure. Well, but it's maybe we could do another podcast on this, but I would pair it with the other essay he did called Inside the Whale, and it's about the Tropic of Cancer, mm-hmm. Henry Miller's Tropic of Cancer, which is a very ugly book. And Miller says, I absolutely adore that book. It's so lyrically beautiful, mm-hmm. And just describing utter filth.
Yeah.
Deep forms of filth.
Right.
And Miller even says this is not a novel, this is slander. He calls it, he says this is not a novel, right. It is slander. He's putting it almost in a different medium.
See, he has moralistic terms for art then. He has an understanding that art is that which is moral, and then he has his own set of morals.
Miller or
Orwell?
Oh,
Orwell
yeah.
does.
Well, because Orwell praises Tropic of Cancer.
Yeah.
And it's one of the most brilliant literary essays I've ever read. Period. On that.
It's like Vonnegut or Nabokov are the same. Like there's such a degree of filth and depravity, but especially when you have a far more expansive definition of art, what that allows me to say is they're writing novels. Like I cannot read Lolita. Like I have tried. And it disgusts me. I just have such a repulsion to it.
I know a few people who that's the case with them. Yeah.
I still recognize that Nabokov is an incredible writer. I've read other of Nabokov's works that I love. I especially love his memoir. It's really good. So I don't degrade him as a person for having written that book, even though I personally cannot handle that book. And so I would never say it's not art or it's not a novel or something like that. It absolutely is. Is it artwork that I want to live with or I can experience? No, it's too horrific a truth. The fact that what that book seems to do, in my opinion, is humanize the pedophile and make it. I don't think it's trying to say it's okay. It's more trying to say, look, we all have these degrees of perversions inside of us. And that is absolutely true. I 100% believe that. And I don't need to spend the time dwelling on that for me to further develop that idea in myself. That's why I can't handle it.
Sure.
I do think that book serves a good purpose, and that I'm glad it exists, and I would never censor it. But yeah, I can't read it
Sure.
yet.
So going back to on the other point of was it called socialist realism, the propaganda artwork that came out of this? So yeah. So what going back to our discussions of what audiences will or will not tolerate, the sense perception of truth in a well-ordered story. What are the conditions, or what are some of the interesting aspects to art that is corny? I mean, and I would say objectively corny, but that the fact that people can delude their built-in shit detector, as Hemingway says, so much to where they can experience it. I mean, I don't know how often I've never had that experience, or I'd like to think I've never had that experience.
Well, I think I might have kind of a controversial opinion on this, because I think the most dangerous thing is a half-truth. There's the famous line from The Usual Suspects that the devil's greatest lie is convincing the world he didn't exist. That's wrong. You can look at the beginning Garden of Eden story to understand what the devil's greatest lie is, and the greatest lie is a half-truth. If you eat this apple, you'll become like God and know good from evil. But then there's a full stop. And it doesn't say, and what are the ramifications of that? And it's like we're living out the ramifications of that. So all propaganda, and this is even why, like, you can save and look at old propaganda and actually begin to see it, because you're divorced from the context of its initial real message or its intended message. Because good propaganda is going to realize that human beings see certain things. So, for example, I talk about this in my basic design class all the time, but it's something like 90% of magazines that make it into their second year of publishing feature symmetrical faces on their covers. And it's like, if you think about that sea of magazine stands, you're a human, what are you going to look at? If you see eyes, you're going to look at them. That's literally what, like, think about how many people you see and how quickly your eyes go to their eyes, and how rarely you're not like staring at their kneecaps or something. And so, so what propagandists are going to be using aesthetics that connect with people, because they understand they have this message, right? I have the gospel I need to preach. And so no matter what, there will be some degree of, I would call it, getting at that objectivity, because they have to use that in order for them to communicate to humans. So all propaganda is going to have some form of truth in it, of human beings are beautiful, or at least some human beings are beautiful, right? Lots of these things are going to be like demonizing the enemy. And so they're attaching themselves to a half-truth. That is, there are people who want to kill you and ruin our way of life. That's true. Absolutely true. Is it true that it's these specific people? And is it true that they deserve whatever, the gulags? No. And that's where it's like, it starts with something that gets you down its path. It befriends you, so to speak. It's, join me in the dark side. That's what it's doing, is it's literally saying, like, we all know, like, I hate people who talk like that. They just sound like propagandists when they always start with, we all know X is true. And then they just jump to Y as if they follow. And it's like, no. But they got you with the, we all know this is true. And so join me on my path, blah, blah. And it's like, that's how you get deluded. Your shit detector starts off, and you turn it off after you get comforted. Oh, this is the same thing I believe. This is the truth. And now you stop keeping your shit detector active and noticing, wait a minute, they've come a long ways. This is also like conspiracy theorists are doing the same thing, but they're bad at it, right? They're bad at distracting you from the shit because they start with one thing that's true. JFK was assassinated. And then they jump multiple dimensions of, well, this occurred and this strange thing occurred, and that means it was a conspiracy by all of the CIA and the FBI and whatever, Yeah. And I think so propaganda, it's easier to look at after the fact because we have experience that really helps us understand the shit. But in that moment, like I think back to I was quite young when 9/11 happened. And I remember all of the, what are we supposed to do? Like, I'm hearing anti-war messages on one side. I'm hearing, defense on the other side. And you're seeing Afghanistan happening. And it's like, there was no way for me as a young teenager to understand what was shit and what wasn't. What was propaganda in the negative sense and what was propaganda in the positive sense. What was presenting the falsehood and lies and what was presenting the truth. And in hindsight, we're able to look back and be like, oh, this was clearly bullshit. There were no weapons of mass destruction or whatever. Even that still, I don't really understand what happened. There's been a lot of shit clouds.
We don't need to go into that because...
But I think that's getting at your question of how is it that that propaganda can trick us. It always has to start with a truth, and then it has to mold that around some false claim. So it's always hiding something inside of a truth.
Well, maybe let's take it to something a bit more lower stakes and kind of something that for some reason we keep returning to. But I find this bizarre love of the new Disney Star Wars by certain people. Like that to me is of the same vein, but much lower stakes. And it's just like, it really just amazes me that, I mean, maybe it is just the dazzle of the special effects is enough to sustain certain people, but the vitriol with which they'll dismiss like the fans of the old series is interesting to me. And also like the fans of the old series can get out of line too. But I mean, these new shows are just so unthinkably bad that it's amazing to me that so many people are going to their defense, almost as if they're defending them obviously for some different ulterior reason.
Yeah.
And it's just, I think that dimension is interesting, and I don't know, like...
I think it's perfect. You can understand it if you look back to Christians in the 80s and 90s, the evangelical Christians, and the kind of crappy art that they were producing, and yet they would constantly defend it. It's because they believe in the ideology behind it. So it's pushing an ideological thing in a clumsy manner, whether it's true or not. But the people who defend it are the ones who believe it's true. And so they would say something like... this is the thing that gets me about, like, this is going to be kind of controversial here, but Black Panther at its core is like a retelling of a kind of Hamlet story. The king is dead, the son takes over, kind of, and he's very indecisive. And so I don't remember the main character's name, but the Black Panther constantly doesn't know what to do, and he frequently is turning to, I believe it's his sister, some wise figure for advice. But because he lacks decisive action, the whole entire motion of the story gets activated, and that is I think it's called Killmongerer takes power, and the reason he's able to do that is because he has a vision. He has a vision for what is right, and obviously it's horrible. He wants to exact revenge on all nations for the way that blacks in America have been treated. Perhaps justified revenge, but he wants all of this, death, hence the name Killmonger. And because of the main guy's not understanding what this guy really wanted, he wasn't really listening to him, he didn't understand the threat, and he didn't act. And then he has to redeem himself from that. And of course, unlike Hamlet, he survives, even though weirdly enough, that actor died. The guy who played back. Yeah, it's very, very strange. It's like, wow, is this just trying to actually correct what Hamlet is about? Where it's like, if you don't act at the right time, you must sacrifice yourself to save the world. That's what I think Hamlet at its core is about. But it's a weird film in the sense of it's getting hailed as this, the first black superhero, this black empowerment film. And I'm sitting there like, your hero is, he's not a great like the sister is a way better, wiser character. You're setting up your hero as kind of a lame duck. And that surprised me that it gets all this praise. And I think it's because it's a couple of things. People are not able to interpret art anymore on a very massive scale. So they're not able to even track and understand. And so when you ask, if you think about it, like, what is a movie about? The way I just described Black Panther. If I asked most fans, that's not what they would say. They would start telling me other arcane details about what happens. It's like, those things don't matter. That's not what the story is about. The story is about a young man who's trying to understand how to be king, and he doesn't know what to do. Because he doesn't know what to do, he loses his kingship. Then he has to fight like hell to get it back. And even then, he's still not really sure how he won. And that's not good. That's not a good story. That's a oh shit, this guy needs to learn something. Why would you want that as your iconic film? It's only if you don't understand what's happening, and it's only if you care about other things. This is the first movie where the first Marvel movie where it's almost all a black cast. That's all the reasons why they like it. I think that there's so much about Star Wars that they're distracted by the small details. It's like, I got to see Obi-Wan again, or I got to see a young Princess Leia. Like,
Yeah.
great. You're those are the folks who are distracted by the glitter and details. And then on top of that, there's the group of people who are like, this is what we want in films, just like the early Christians in the 90s. We want films that say Jesus at the end and people pray on screen. It's like, yeah, but it's dumb and it's not uplifting and it means something completely different than what you think. But it's like, yeah, but all I need is that. All I need is that little bit of propaganda. I think that's a lot of it.
Yeah.
The main tie-in to Saunders, the fact that we got to propaganda, I think, talks about the fact that what Saunders is describing is how the creative process helps us discover new things and how the best stories do that. And the propaganda will be forgotten. The things that have lasting truth will be useful throughout history. And that's where, I think about especially the propagandists like the evangelical Christian who's sitting there like, all things must glorify God. I need to make something that'll glorify God. You actually have a lack of faith there. You think that if you let go control, God won't be glorified. Or, you think if you don't have, whatever minority group as the lead star, people won't get the message that those people are important. And it's like, you're devaluing everything. I think about the way in which the recent Star Wars films have put forward the ethnically diverse cast and how that's so important. All that, like, that's great. I literally don't care. I think I want good characters. And what they're doing when they're doing that is they're degrading the good characters of the past. Lando Calrissian is a very interesting character, especially if you look at him meaningfully. And he's played by a black actor, and he does an incredible job. And literally, like if you're thinking about the films like I've been discussing them, at the end of the last film, the person who blows up the Death Star is Lando Calrissian. Why isn't that being hailed? It literally cheapens the accomplishments of the past because it's so forgetful and it's so maniacally focused on this ideology. Whereas if you have the faith of a process like Saunders talks about, you're risking, oh my God, what if I write a story that doesn't work with my ideology? Whether that's, some religion or some philosophical movement or social cause. Well, you don't have to publish it, first of all. I guess that's the thing. When you have the low stakes of like us as compared to Disney, you don't have to publish it, but you might actually find something that's way greater. You might actually find an interesting movie that moves beyond. And, Jordan Peele has some really interesting interviews where he's answering questions about Get Out. Is that the...
Yeah, that's his first movie.
Yeah, his first movie. I haven't seen the other ones, but that movie is very interesting, really beautifully done. And he reveals in those questions that he was working in a process like Saunders describes here, because he has so many things where he made a movie that is smarter than him. And he's literally like, wow, I didn't see that in there, but you're absolutely right. He's constantly talking about, oh my God, like I was just kind of writing in this manner and this seemed right. And I was just going intuitively, and he made an awesome film. And that's what this process allows, is if you have the faith to give in and let things flow, you might find something that's far more interesting than the one stupid little thought you have in your brain that you think is amazing.
Yeah.
And that I think is what Saunders gets at with all of this. And that's why it's incredibly hard to make art.
Sure. Well, he made a movie that's smarter than him. That's such a great way of putting it. And that's, I mean, in many respects, like a lot of artists make, if they succeed, they make a piece that's smarter than them.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Which, I mean, and it also goes to, I mean, I find so many people, whether it's Picasso's despicable behavior, it's almost like people lump the art in with it, but the art in some senses existing on a different field. It's it's smarter and deeper than just the single person.
Yeah, and that's where I could talk about Picasso for a long time. He's a terrible person, but he looked at humans objectively, as in he looked at them as objects. He treats objects like women, man. That's a Big Lebowski quote. But he literally, like, he treated humans, specifically women, as objects. And so he's able to make these objectifying paintings that I find quite reprehensible. I think it's not good to look at human beings and objects as objects. And Sally Mann actually has some interesting photographs of dead bodies that does something similar, but does it in a manner that I think returns humanity to literal corpses. Beautiful work, very hard to look at. I mean, it's a series of photographs from morgues and the wounds that caused death. It's very, very difficult. So I find Sally Mann's work like still celebrating humanity, and a lot of Picasso's work is not. It is like, I think the weeping woman is almost making fun of the woman crying, which is a very Macbeth thing to do. But all of that enables him to make Guernica when the news comes out about the tragedy of Guernica. And I think that Guernica is not just a painting of the tragedy of Guernica. It is all tragedy. And perhaps, I'm not saying this is worth it, and this doesn't justify Picasso's lifestyle, but perhaps if Picasso didn't objectify people, he wouldn't have noticed all of the ways in which shelling an unarmed city of women and children for 5 hours is an ultimate objectifying of people. They were strafing citizens in fields that weren't even firing back for 5 hours. And so perhaps Picasso was needed to make that painting because he was a despicable person. And that gets to a little bit of Saunders when he says, you can never control the kind of writer you're going to be. Because the creative practice is not one of control. It's one of noticing what's going on around you.
Well, we're getting, I think, a little on. I think that was a full meal, don't you? Is there anything else, any outstanding comments? Or how about let's end on, last time we talked, you had a beautiful explanation of what the title, A Swim in the Pond in the Rain, means. Would you want to go into that?
My memory might need... well, I think I know where I was going. Like, I don't want to let folks down. Perhaps I've already forgotten what it means, but my mind goes to because it's the title of one of the stories. Not quite the title of one of the stories.
Gooseberries. It's from Gooseberries. So
Gooseberries, the story of a gentleman kind of losing his mind, so to speak, and enjoying himself in the middle of a pond while it's raining, while his other friends are like, "You're crazy. We got to go inside," if I remember correctly.
Yeah.
And this whole entire book is like that. We get this experience of the stories are raining down on us and creating a pond. And every time you read or interact with a work of art, you get to swim in that pond while it continues to rain. And we keep making art and it continues piling up. And it's a swim that helps us understand how to live. To go back to that Robert Adams quote, it's the responsibility of artists to pay attention to the world, pleasant or otherwise, and to help us live respectfully in it. It's like you only get to live one life, and you're going to make tons of mistakes. If you pay attention to the stories and the artwork of others, you're getting a little sense as to how they live their lives. You're getting an extra life, so to speak, just like in a video game. And so if you swim in this pond, your ultimate swim is going to be better because it's going to improve your swimming in the real pond.
Yeah. Well, and the Adams quote reminds me of the Saunders quote that has stuck with me still. And one of the primary things that stuck with me from this book was that artists take responsibility.
Yeah.
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 Okay. Well, thanks for meeting with me again.
Absolutely.
We'll have to do it again. Maybe Orwell read is in order.
Oh, dear God, yeah. I've been wanting to not read that book recently.